Okay, I think we're just about ready to get started. Thank you all for being here, and we'll start off with Jordan.
So, thank you guys for being here tonight. This is another exciting edition of our 3-part author series with our NAMI Speaker Series. Abby White wrote a book and reached out to a lot of NAMI affiliates just offering to share her book with us if we wanted. And I said, why don't you come down and talk about it? So we were really excited when she agreed to drive down. Abby lives in Washington, D.C., but she is from Shaker Heights. So we happened to catch her while she was doing an Ohio visit, and she graciously drove down to Athens to share her experiences and part of her book with us. And I won't do a lot of information on Abby because she's going to talk about her life and her story, but this is her first published book, but she actually wrote her first book when she was 7. It was called Lion Girl, the girl who could turn into a lion. Mm-hmm. So she clearly had a writing bug at an early age. So I thought that was pretty cool. There is a little bit of a content warning. This discussion will talk about suicide, loss, and grief and mental health, just so you know. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Abby. We do have books here if you'd like a signed book to purchase from Little Professor. We thank them for being here tonight as well. And here's Abby. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Jordan. Can everybody hear me all right? Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. As Jordan said, I remain Abby. It was so exciting to get this invitation, and I'm truly thrilled to join you all. And I know that some people are here and getting continuing education credits from Ohio University. So I do want to say up front that there are some approved learning objectives for this talk. So in case you need to tell a professor or supervisor of any kind about this, I'm really hoping that some of what you get by the end of this discussion is being able to discuss the differences between suicide, loss, and other forms of grief, having a better sense of how to evaluate people who are dealing with suicide, loss, and related symptoms of mental illness, the kinds of resources that might be most helpful to design and provide for people suffering from this condition and state of being, and how to implement this understanding of suicide, loss in relation to other forms of grief and mental health across a community and within your own homes and communities. So, without further ado, hi, again. If you haven't heard it enough already, I'm Abby. I'm a young adult author. This is my debut novel, DJ Rosenblum Becomes the G.O.A.T. And it is truly such a joy and a thrill to be here today. I hadn't been to Athens before, but as Jordan said, I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I have a bunch of friends from high school who went to OU. Always heard wonderful things about here, and I've just been so charmed by the community. So thank you, Athens Library, for hosting, Little Professor for providing copies, and above and beyond NAMI Athens, Jordan, Santana, Christian, the whole team for bringing me here today and being such fantastic partners. I reached out to NAMI Athens, among other NAMI chapters, because this debut novel of mine, even though it is so many things, right? It's for young people, it's fun, it's funny. I think the core of it more than anything else is that it is about mental health, and it's really important to me, both as a writer and as someone who has dealt with this intimately myself, to share it with other people. So I assume most of you haven't had a chance to pick it up or read it yet, which is totally fine and expected. So I will just tell you the quick summary is that DJ Rosenblum Becomes the G.O.A.T. is the story of a 14-year-old queer Jewish girl and queen in suburban Ohio who is preparing for her belated bat mitzvah while investigating her cousin's mysterious death, navigating a new school and friendships, and being 14, which is one of the most terrible states a person can be in. So I wrote this novel for the same reason I imagine a lot of you are here today, which is that I've dealt with mental health issues for, at this point, a majority of my life. As a teenager, pictured here with bright green braces, you can't quite tell in the Snapchat quality photo, that was when I first started to deal with anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. I saw a therapist for the first time when I was 14. And I was very lucky to be able to get the care that I needed and to have a very supportive family in helping me access that. But the incident that inspired this story and that I really used writing as therapy to help deal with was shortly after I graduated from college in 2019. A friend of mine who I love very much ended her life. Her name was Lisa. She was an incredibly beautiful person. When she died, I was 23 and she was 22. So after January 2020, nothing happened in the United States or the world. Nothing happened in 2020 that anyone would remark upon. And because nothing was happening, I moved back in with my parents in Cleveland. For a pandemic, it was a lot safer to live in suburban Ohio than in Washington, D.C. And it was a really interesting confluence of events where, I was less than 2 months out from the really devastating event and death of my dear friend. And also all of these sort of distractions and structures of everyday life that I had come to rely upon had vanished. Right? I didn't have my community of friends. I didn't have the therapist I had started seeing in DC because she wasn't licensed to work online yet. There's a whole vacuum of resources. And I was back in the house where I had spent my entire childhood and adolescence, back with my parents. And that does something kind of elemental to you, I think. And so in those, mid-months of 2020, really from March onwards, I had a mental health crisis, unlike any I had faced for a few years at that point. And I want to be really clear that I had faced grief before. My grandparents had passed away and I had lost other people in my life. But this was the first time someone that I loved had died by suicide. And it was a revelatory experience in terms of learning how different suicide loss is from other forms of grief. And I think that experience more than anything, and that revelation, was what inspired this story and what made it so difficult to get through. There were questions that I couldn't answer or parse through about what had happened and why. There were feelings of self-blame and self-loathing that inflamed the depression that I had under treatment at that point. There was a sort of chronic replaying of events that pulled me out of the present and more positive aspects of my life and made it really hard to center myself anywhere but that past. And then just the most complex mix of emotions, where, in the past, I think when I had experienced grief, there was a relative simplicity about it, right? You love someone and they have passed, and that is sad. In this case, because of the nature of my friend's death, there were so many more feelings than I had ever expected. I was angry. I was as angry as I've ever been. I felt betrayed, even though nothing per se had been done to me. And I was so confused all the time. I mean, it really felt like a full alphabet of feelings that maybe I had experienced in microcosms before, suddenly taking over my whole life. And I was lucky enough that, again, my therapist did get online and I was able to resume individual therapy, and I had a really supportive, parents, and I did have friends who were checking in as best they could from, not being able to see me in person. And there are so many great support resources for people who are dealing with grief. But none of them represented my own mix of experiences, the questions, the mix of feelings, the intense self-blame and self-loathing, and the way I found it so difficult to step out of that. All of those experiences made it so different from a typical grief experience and so much harder to face, and therefore made a lot of really wonderful grief resources less helpful to me, even if they were still accessible. And really this experience was how I came to the view, which is part of what I reflect in the novel and part of what I feel so strongly about and want to talk to other people who care about mental health about, that suicide loss is a distinct form of grief that may be likelier than some other kinds to become a prolonged grief disorder and earn its own individual mental health categorization. So the Mayo Clinic has, I think, a really good sort of broad definition, starting definition of what mental illness is and what mental health disorders are as a range of conditions which affect your mood, thinking, and behaviors, and whose ongoing signs and symptoms cause frequent stress and affect your ability to function. Most of the time, most therapists and other mental health counselors and professionals wouldn't count grief as a mental illness or a mental health disorder because it is temporary, because it has a clear motivator or spark from the outside world. It's not caused by an inner imbalance of hormones, etc. So one way to phrase this is that grief generally isn't considered pathological. That's a key distinction between a hard experience somebody might have versus a chronic health condition or a chronic mental health condition. And in my experience, suicide loss is different and more likely to become a sort of pathological mental health challenge because of the ways it can implicate the person who's grieving, right? When I lost my grandmother to being 96 years old, I was not remotely implicated. I was sad. I missed her. I cried. But she was 96. At some point, there's nothing anyone could do. Or when a very close family friend of mine died of cancer when I was young, they had received wonderful treatment. It wasn't enough. That didn't implicate me. But in the case of someone I loved with whom I was in close contact who died by suicide, there was no single entity to blame, but we're hardwired to point fingers, aren't we? I think that's so much of the human experience is looking for a cause to match the effect. And unfortunately, I think part of what we learn growing up is that the universe isn't quite as simple as that. So as much as we want to know who's responsible in the absence of someone who clearly deserves blame, we blame ourselves. We wonder what we could have done, why we didn't do more, why we weren't enough to convince someone we loved to stay. That was certainly my experience, where I had spent every day with Lisa for 3 weeks. And those feelings afterwards really tortured me. And the only way, really, that I could start getting through it was by putting myself in the shoes of a younger person in this really elemental state and starting to move through the experience from her lens. Because something I've been taught, something that I believe strongly, is that once you can teach something, you are a master of it. And if I could teach my character, this younger person, this girl who is like a younger version of me, but very much not me in some distinct ways, if I could teach her how to deal with this impossible state of feelings, then maybe I could too. So we meet 14-year-old DJ, my sweet child, and we get into the story of DJ Rosenblum Becomes the G.O.A.T. Now, I'm about to spoil a major part of the story for you, but I hope if you find it interesting, you will still read the book afterwards. Now, the plot of DJ Rosenblum Becomes the G.O.A.T. appears for the first half of the book like a murder mystery. DJ and her mom moved to Briar, Ohio, which is in Northeast Ohio. I made it up. It's Rachel's hometown. They moved there to help Rachel's parents and younger brother cope with the aftermath of her death. And this death was reported as a suicide. But DJ is convinced it was a murder, and throughout the book investigates it as such. Only at the midpoint of the book does DJ's best friend tell her and tell the reader that she's been deluding herself the entire time. The investigation is a coping mechanism. The evidence she has is mostly fabricated in her head. Rachel did die by suicide at the age of 17. DJ simply can't accept that. Indeed, at this point, we see how several, and when I say we, I mean the close reader, the reader who enjoys the story and envelops the story and thinks about how the craft elements of a story come together. We see how several elements of the craft of writing have colluded to reflect DJ's mental health in this story. Now, I know this is a room of people who are engaged in the story from a mental health perspective. Please stay with me as I get a little nerdy about writing. Okay, will you stay with me?
Yep.
Can I hear it louder?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's get into the craft of writing here. There are 3 pieces of craft that, and there are certainly more that a person could name, that I think are probably the most important in determining the tenor and setting of a story that carry through the whole book. There's structure, narrator, and language. And so when we reach this midpoint of the book where we find out that actually there is no murder mystery, DJ has made it up because she cannot face what has happened. The first craft element that we're dealing with intimately is structure, right? This is where I, as an author, read older murder mysteries and mysteries written for young people now, sort of old Nancy Drew type stories, and try to mimic the pace of those, try to create the same kinds of plot diversions and elements. This is where we get setting as something that's really important involved in the structure of the book. So if you think about the kind of environment that can feel both enveloping in a comforting way, but also a little suffocating depending on your mood. I ended up creating this small town in Northeast Ohio that's, similar in some ways to where I grew up, but with certain elements amplified. And then you have the sort of range and pace of events, right? If DJ is distracting herself from the truth of what has happened, that means the reader has to have distractions too, right? And so then we get the other characters, we get DJ's relationships, we get the hijinks that are inherent in a group of 13 and 14-year-olds investigating a murder, or so they think, Even something as simple as going into the high school can become a caper when you're not supposed to be in the high school. So we have that first craft element of structure that starts to reveal itself to the reader as being a little more intentional than you might have thought. And then we have the narrator herself. DJ is what we call a close first-person narration. So she narrates from the I point of view. I did this, I did that. It's not omniscient first person where, there's very little omniscient first person, actually, for all you reading nerds listening to this. But you don't, in a story like Harry Potter is a very well-known one, although I don't share the politics of the author. A story like that is written in the third person. It's talking about Harry, but occasionally there will be chapters from the Malfoy's perspective, from Severus Snape's perspective. That doesn't happen in this kind of book because it is close first person. We are only in DJ's head. We only see and experience what she sees and experiences. It's also written in the present tense, so we only have what is directly in front of her, right? We see the past, but only filtered through her lens. We see the present and are quite firmly rooted in that, all of which makes it easier for DJ to be an unreliable narrator. There aren't many unreliable narrators in children's fiction because it generally isn't in line with a lot of children's experiences, right? I think children are often, relatively honest depictors of what they're going through. But I think that in this case, when you go through this kind of extraordinary experience, but also one that far too many young people have gone through, are going through, will continue to go through, when you're not developmentally prepared to deal with that kind of challenge, it's not an intentional deceit. You're deceiving yourself as well, and so that makes you unreliable to yourself, but also to the people around you. And so these very intentional aspects of first person and present tense narration created the opportunity for self-deception and reader deception. And then language, which I am such a nerd about, so again, thank you for bearing with me. But I really wanted language throughout the story that, for one thing, has the kind of bouncy, cascading rhythm that carries you forward, even when it's a really hard emotion that we're depicting. descriptions in line with the first person and present tense narration, descriptions which are entirely tied to the narrator's emotional state, right? There's nothing that's described that does not also give a sense of what DJ is feeling. So there's no ancillary or unnecessary description, which, is not unnecessary for all writers. Some writers are more descriptive than others. And then the last piece of language that was really important to me was what we call embodied emotion, where, as I'm sure all of you know, as many of us experience, there are the feelings that we are conscious of and aware of that we can sort of think through in the moment. And then there's the body stubbornly keeping the score, right? Sometimes there are feelings that we have that we maybe don't want to face, don't want to talk about, might not even be fully conscious of, but we feel physically tense, or tears well up behind our eyes, or we feel our breathing speeding up or getting more jagged, even though in our heads this shouldn't be happening. So writing DJ throughout the book with that kind of embodied emotion, I see as a little foreshadowing of the narrative twist that comes at the middle, when we find out that there's no murder mystery after all. Because even though DJ comes across as a very logical, smart, centered observer of her world, pretty emotionally balanced, she has these moments where her body reacts so strongly to something that I see it as a bit of a giveaway of what she's truly dealing with here, that she's not letting herself reckon with. And also, again, drawn so intimately and personally from my own experience of mental health challenges, especially of depression and anxiety and the panic attacks that in my case came with that. And so we see, I'm not going to read this whole page to you guys, but we see some of the examples of what this language might look like in practice just within these few paragraphs that I took from the very first chapter of DJ. So we see, in terms of descriptions that illuminate the narrator's emotional state and nothing more, I don't describe the hallway, I only describe what Rachel's door looks like. In terms of the sort of swift, bouncy rhythm that I think carries the reader, we can see across this excerpt that there are different sentence lengths, and there are fragments as well as full sentences. Some sentences have multiple clauses, so that's where the sentence is split by a comma or a colon or a semicolon. Others are straightforward and short. All of that creates a sort of texture that keeps the reader engaged, right? In the same way that if you're driving down the highway and there's nothing there, you are going to get tired. Whereas if you have a few other cars, or maybe some hills, you're going to be very alert the entire time. And then the embodied emotion, where, it's not just that DJ sees and reacts to the door to Rachel's room. It's this really bodily centered description of bile sprinting up her throat as if it's an agent of its own. The song reedy in her ears as if you can sort of feel it physically against your eardrums. Finding those opportunities to really ground DJ's emotional experience and her physical experience, I think was really important in not just foreshadowing the narrative twist that is so core to the book, but also in ensuring that there's a unity between this first half of the book, where you think the story is one kind of thing, sort of a murder mystery, sort of a caper, and the second half of the book, where even if DJ hasn't accepted it, the reader knows what's going on. The reader knows that she is deluding herself. And how do you stick with her and start to deal with that and see the unity between those characters? So, we have this narrative midpoint where once what we thought was a sort of plucky Nancy Drew-esque adventure becomes something entirely different. And I don't want to give away how DJ reckons with that second half of the book, reckons with the experience of Rachel's death, recognizing the cause of Rachel's death. But I will say that Her story exemplifies and dramatizes the truth that I discovered firsthand about how suicide loss can become a form of prolonged grief disorder, and it perhaps is a little more likely to become a form of prolonged grief disorder in a way that can really significantly affect both the afflicted person's ability to function and their overall quality of life. In both my case and DJ's case, we began to recover once we started to open up about our experiences, seeking professional health. In my case, getting back with my therapist and pursuing a more regular regimen of speaking with her. In DJ's case, she becomes very close with one of the rabbis at her synagogue as part of preparing for her belated bat mitzvah. And this person, it turns out, has their own experiences with grief that make them really well suited to helping DJ. And I really want to emphasize the phrasing of began to recover, because it's a lifelong journey, right? As I think anyone who has dealt with these kinds of things, anyone in this room, I'm sure knows. And as part of acknowledging these experiences, speaking up about these experiences, sharing them with a trusted professional, both myself and DJ had to acknowledge our suffering and give voice to the chronic nature of it, the fact that it was inescapable, that it was out of our control, and that it had gone from being provoked by an external event into something that was more habitually interacting with our hormone levels and existing mental illness. And I want to be clear also in terms of my approach to writing about mental health in young adult literature, suicide loss in young adult literature. At no point do I name suicide loss within the book. At no point do I even name, per se, the symptomatic mental health conditions like anxiety and depression that DJ is dealing with. And that's because I think people experience them regardless of the names. People experience them, especially when they're young and they may not have access to the kinds of resources that we as adults do. People experience them and may not know what to call it, and their first person experience of it, it doesn't always matter what it's called, it matters that they're going through it. And with young adult fiction, fiction for children especially, it's so important not to be didactic, because otherwise young people have a tendency to turn their ears off, right? They spend enough time in school with teachers, learning about explicit things, remembering key terms. If they're reading something, even if it's something educational, they want to be engaged and entertained, and it's important not to cross that boundary. So I don't say in the book this neat argument that I've presented to you about treating suicide loss as a sort of mental health condition on its own, or at least in certain cases. But I do believe the novel shows the need for families and mental health professionals to take suicide loss more seriously, both as a distinct kind of grief and as a potential early sign of mental illness like exacerbated depression, exacerbated anxiety, prolonged grief disorder that can be chronic and incredibly hard to move through without external support and resources. And a few of the resources that I think it's clear from the book that DJ would have benefited from are a dedicated therapist from the moment her cousin Rachel passed away, a support group for survivors of suicide loss, preferably for people of her age group, right? She has her mom, she has her aunt and uncle. None of them are going through the same experiences as a 14-year-old girl. Open lines of communication with her parents and extended family, which can be so hard even for a kid who loves and trusts their family to establish when they think they might be adding a burden upon people who are already struggling. These are people who can also help them help her share her feelings with her friends, which in some ways can be, sometimes less challenging because they're not authority figures, but in some ways even more challenging because you don't want to self-label as different from the people in your community and in your peer groups. And then books, movies, and TV shows that focus not on suicide, because we actually have a good number of those, and some of them, not all of them, but some of them are quite good, but on the aftermath. I think that one of the things that was most revelatory for me about dealing with the loss of my dear friend was that I could find plenty of books and media about a person who had died by suicide or a person contemplating suicidal thoughts or ideation. What I didn't see was the aftermath, the way that this one stone thrown into a pond causes ripples that fill the entire lake. And as someone going through that ripple, stuck in that ripple in the same way that a river will carry you along, even if you grab a branch, that was what I needed, and that was what I think DJ needed too. So I really hope that DJ Rosenblum Becomes the G.O.A.T will become one of these resources for children and families and mental health professionals who are dealing with this very particular experience. And something that I've kept in mind in my own experience and in writing this story is that there's this really well-known proverb that I've always thought is beautiful, that it takes a village to raise a child. And what I discovered through my personal experience and through the experience of writing and researching for DJ was that it takes a village to keep a child too. And in the context of DJ, it's not just Rachel, it's DJ herself, right? It's so easy for these kids, not just in the initial stone in the pond, but in the ripples afterwards, to fall through the cracks. And it comes to the whole community, from immediate family to extended family to friends and teachers and librarians and mental health professionals like the wonderful people in this room, to keep an eye on our young people who are so vulnerable and not always developmentally equipped to deal with the things that are thrust upon them. And one of the things that I have found empowering, both in the aftermath of my friend's passing and also in the writing of this book, is that we can all be part of that village. Any of us within our communities can become involved with organizations like NAMI, with volunteer roles in libraries or schools, can make ourselves available for the young people who might need that trusted person, or that one person who says, hey, it looks like this might have crossed a line, right? We can raise awareness of the mental health implications of suicide loss. We can better serve those people who are suffering, and we can cultivate communities of care and compassion for everybody within our ranks, from young people to any age. So I want to thank all of you for putting this vision into action, for working hard with NAMI Athens, and for joining me today. It truly means a great deal to me, not just professionally, but very personally, to talk about this with all of you, and to share this difficult experience with all of you in the spirit of trust and vulnerability and knowing that we have more in common than we do different. And so I am truly just very, very grateful and touched to be with you all today. Thank you for joining and for being advocates. And I'd love to take any questions you have. Thanks, everybody. Yes?
You said you don't use labels as far as the feelings, but do you clearly say she's grieving?
Yes, very much so. And thank you for that clarifying question. I think the book is most explicitly about grieving above anything else, and it's something that she and her rabbi talk about in depth. It's something that once DJ becomes more in touch with her feelings, she and her mother talk about more in depth. In her case, she has a single mother, and so she doesn't talk about this with her father. And that felt like a sort of balance as the writer for how to talk about these experiences in a way that would translate and give the reader enough information to go look for more resources without ever feeling overly educational or didactic, right? I think grief is a little bit more of a familiar concept, even for that age group, than chronic depression or clinical anxiety or suicide loss. So thank you for that clarifying question. The book is very clearly about grief. And I should say also, as you will see if you decide to pick up a copy of the book, either here or from the library, there is an author's note at the beginning of the book with resources about grief and suicide, loss and prevention, and mental health more broadly. So those are also a little bit of like a fourth wall breaking way to provide more information and key terms to the reader should they wish them. And it was just about making sure the story itself was not so educational as to turn some kids off. Thank you for the clarifying question. Yes. Does anyone else have questions? Yes.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Oh gosh, how long did it take me to write the book? I would say that I had the first seed of an idea in July 2020. So that was in the thick of my own journey with my grief and mental health. And in that case, when I say a kernel of the idea, I had a vision of a girl like but not totally the same as who I once was, giving her Devar Torah, which is the sermon that's part of a bar bat mitzvah, about what she had learned about this grief, about this suicide loss. And that was always the guiding image. I always knew that the sort of A plot of mystery and the B plot of bat mitzvah preparation would land in that really combined place at the end. And so I had that guiding image and really just thought about the book for like a year and a half without writing anything. But in that time, in a true, boon to my subconscious, congratulations subconscious, I I really figured out what the story was, right? I really think that in my case, taking that time to just think about it and let it live on its own in my head allowed the idea to come to fruition, so that by the time I started writing, which I can name the exact date, it was December 31st, 2021, because I wanted a little bit of the New Year's resolution thing, but not so exact as to rely upon the new year, or just the year 2022. At that point, when I sat down to write, I knew exactly what the story was. There were some details, some smaller details in the middle especially, that I still had to figure out as I went through, but the rest of it really, the book that you could read is very similar to what I started at that point. So from the point of ideation, it was about 5 years from kernel of the idea to the book getting published on August 5th of this year, which is relatively fast. I got very, very lucky, quite fast actually. And from the point of actually putting something down on paper, that would be 3.5 years, I would say. So
during that time period,
yeah.
Did you ever have feelings that you just maybe never would complete it, or you were just going to step away?
Yeah.
Did you have a feeling of frustration about the whole process?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it was a journey for you, and it was very cathartic for you.
Yeah.
Which, with all the emotions, it's hard sometimes to continue on the journey.
Right. Right. No, that's a really thoughtful question about whether it was ever hard to continue it, and whether I ever thought about dropping it. I think the short answer is no. But the longer answer is that I think that my groundings as a writer became more and more important the farther I got into this process and the farther I got into my own emotional journey. Because at the beginning of this story, when I started thinking about it, even when I started writing it on December 31st, 2021, it was still cathartic and sort of actively putting what I was feeling on the page and in this character and within the characters in her life as well, right? DJ is not the only person grieving in this book. But it was a really interesting sort of duality where the farther I got into writing it, the better I happened to be dealing with my own feelings and experiences, because I had spent more time in therapy, because I had done the work of the book, because I had found other resources and connected with some other people in Lisa's life that, we were able to support each other better. And so I reached a point actually where something I talked about with both my therapists and with my writing mentors was, how do I keep working on this story when I'm no longer in this mental place, right? When it's actually difficult and maybe even detrimental to put myself in this mental place. And that was the point where my foundations as a writer became really critical. And that's part of why, even in this talk that is so much about mental health and literature and for an audience of mental health advocates and professionals, I wanted to talk about craft, because that, I think, is the difference between journaling and writing out your feelings and making a project out of what you're feeling, and turning that into a separate organism from yourself that can be resonant and applicable to people besides you, right? Because my journaling from that period of time is fulsome with all of these feelings and more. But that's not actually a resonant document that another person can really see themselves in, I think. That's not really an emotional journey or narrative arc that carries the reader through and out of those feelings. And so at the point where I would have been really tempted to step away from the book, it was my grounding in craft, which was from studying it in school and reading a ton and studying it in another school, and the mentors that I had, that allowed me to return to the story with the distance of a writer rather than the intimacy of the journaler, so to speak. And see DJ as a person very much outside myself, who, I mean, early on in writing this book, I had to make a chart of like things DJ had that I didn't, because we were too similar and I had to make us different. And that ended up being really important at this point, because DJ at that point was her own person, and I could write her without writing myself. And so it's a really thoughtful question, because I think inevitably, especially if the writing is working as a form of therapy and self-expression, you will reach a point where you are separated from your character. In my case, I think being able to take that step back and continue working on the book was one of the most foundational parts of my own healing, because going back to what I said earlier about how, something that I follow is that once you can teach something, you're a master of it. It was really at that point that I would say I began teaching it and not just going through it and sharing it, right? The moment where I could step back and say, I'm not feeling this in the moment, but DJ is, and I can still write that. That was the moment where I felt like I was teaching the feeling rather than just word vomiting my feelings onto the page. So thank you for that question. It's very thoughtful. Yes.
Have you been able to get the book where every place you want it, or have you had any confrontations and people saying, no, this isn't, we can't have this in our school or in our, that was my question.
Yes.
Have you backlash
Yeah.
or no?
Yeah. I think that, so the question being, have I gotten backlash or confrontation to this book that has prevented me from getting it where I wanted?
Yeah.
I don't think it is big enough to be banned yet. I don't think enough people know about it, which I'm going to ride that wave as long as I can. I sort of expect that if I am successful, if the book is successful, it will be banned, given how things are going today in a lot of communities politically, and also the kinds of things that are in this book, right? It's not just that this is a book about suicide loss. It's also a book about a bisexual 14-year-old who has a crush on a boy and a girl within the book. It's a book about a very proudly Jewish family that only lives by their Jewish rituals, as I did growing up, which some people can find as threatening in dominantly Christian communities. And it's also a book where, and this is, if anything, this is a piece I've actually received the most reaction to. DJ swears sometimes, and so do her friends, because I was once 14, as I suspect most of us in this room were. And there really was no time where I cursed and tested those boundaries more, because they were really safe boundaries to test, and I had something to prove, right? And I think we can all remember being that young and figuring out who you are and how you position yourself within your community and the little things you test or try in order to feel comfortable in who you are in your community. So I haven't been banned yet. I guess I sort of hope I am one day, but I don't, because that'll be a major pain in the butt. What I have faced some backlash about is, first of all, the swearing. I think, if anything, a lot of people have become a little more puritanical about that now than even when I was a kid, where I remember reading books where characters swore when I was, 12 to 16, and they were given to me. I didn't necessarily find them myself, and now it seems like that is much more of a leap for some people. And I certainly have faced questions, I would say, not quite backlash, but questions about writing about suicide loss for a character who's this young and characters who are this young. And what I've said to all of that, and I was talking to Jordan about it earlier today, is the kids are dealing with this, right? I mean, Jordan kindly shared that today NAMI Athens did some Ending the Silence events with local middle schools. And those kids were engaged. And they needed to hear what they were being told about suicide prevention, about mental illness. Because, unfortunately, even if we never talk about this, there are still kids who are going to feel this way, and still kids who are going to experience it somewhere in their life, right? Like, DJ herself is fine until this horrible thing happens within her life over which she has no control. And that's when the repercussions need more support and resources to be dealt with. So I feel very strongly that a story about this topic is not just appropriate for this age group, but really important for them. It's something that I needed when I was that age, and that was the age when I started to feel suicidal ideation for the first time, and I didn't know what was happening to me. And the only reason I was able to get through it is because someone else told me what was happening to me and got me in a therapist's office. And so I hope that as the book spends a little more time out there and finds its readers, that the people who are a little confused or maybe not so supportive or understanding about that need for this age group, I hope that they come to see it, especially given that we live in a world where the average 14-year-old is on TikTok or Instagram or any number of social media platforms, seeing any number of things that are not curated for their age group, that are not meant to be age appropriate, with deep study and learning, and in my case, a master's degree in children and young adult literature, thinking about what developmental standards and stages are. Where they can open TikTok and see footage of a war crime in real time. And you think they can't read a book? So so there has been a little bit of, if not quite backlash, than questions or questioning. And I really think the story just speaks for itself. And I hope that people keep reading it so that they can keep seeing it's necessary. And I really, really hope that right now there are not that many books about suicide loss for kids of this age. And I would say even more broadly, and this gets a little bit into the publishing weeds, so be very kind, stay with me. There aren't that, if young adult literature is characterized as 12 to 18, which it is, there aren't that many books for the younger part of that age group, right? We have middle grade books, and which is sort of 8 to 12, where you'll get like Captain Underpants and a lot of like these popular graphic novels and Magic Treehouse. And then we have what we think of typically as young adult, might be a book like The Hunger Games, which is certainly young adult and great for teens, but Katniss is 17 in the first book, right? That is a 16 and up novel, and that's part of why it's so popular among adults. That 12 to 16 age group is really underserved within publishing. And this is something that booksellers talk about a lot, bookstores, librarians. And part of why I wanted DJ to be very firmly within the center of that age group is because I remember being that age and having very little to read that was actually for my age group. I read a lot of things that were a little too old for me. I read some things that were that felt too young for me and were therefore boring. And so I really, really hope that DJ is not alone in this category. That would be absurd for me to claim. But I do think the category remains underserved. So I hope DJ is soon joined by a lot of other books for that 12 to 16 range, because I do think that age group, they're in the trenches. It's so hard to be that age. It's the worst condition. And then I hope as more and more of those books exist for that age, more and more of them deal with these kinds of topics that really do, I think, have to be tailored for that age group that is on the precipice of being more in control of their lives and their bodies, but they're not there yet and they know it. And that is so awful. That is like a worse awareness than Eve biting the apple. You know, it's awful. So I'll stop the rambling there, but I really hope that DJ finds those readers that have those questions and that they give the book a chance and see that it's doing something that some kids need. Does anybody else have questions? Yes.
You've talked some about sort of distinguishing yourself from the character.
Yes.
One of the things that stood out that I really love, and I'm a therapist, I love therapy.
Amazing, love.
Like one of the distinctions is that some of your healing path took place in therapy, some of the characters does not.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, like I love that choice.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that was like an intentional choice, so it didn't become a didactic like therapy
Yeah.
for kids, like that it was more about community and seeking support rather than therapy specific. I'm just curious about that choice.
That's a wonderful question, and I haven't been asked it yet, so thank you. Yes, it very much is one of the intentional departures from my own journey, that in my case, therapy was really important for me, both in my own independent mental health journey and then in the aftermath of my friend's passing, whereas DJ is not in therapy, and the professional help she ends up getting is from, in her case, a clergy person. It's from her rabbi with whom she's working directly and one-on-one in preparation for her bat mitzvah. And I did that for a few different reasons. One of them, and again, like it comes back down to being a writer and craft, was narrative efficiency of a book can only handle so many characters. And if she's already starting to confide in this one person, it'll confuse the reader if you add too many others. So that's one level of it. But I also wanted, to make clear in DJ's case, I think if you think about a lot of stories, whether in books or TV shows or movies about young people, one of the things that characterizes media for young people and about young people is that they are the agents of their own journeys. So the comparison I like to give for this is the book To Kill a Mockingbird, which has as its protagonist Scout, who is 6 years old, but that is not a book for children. And that's not actually because of the subject matter, because if you read it when you're too young, as I did, it is written in a veiled way that is accessible to 6-year-old Scout and 8-year-old me, even if you don't get everything. But the difference and the reason that it is an adult novel about a child is that Scout is acted upon and goes down paths that other people pave, right? She's not really making the choices that drive the story. She exists and observes when her father is the lawyer. She exists and observes when this case happens and the people in her town are implicated within it. She's not driving the action. In any book or TV show or movie for a young person with that as the primary audience, the young protagonist has to be driving the action. And the real way that happens is if the young person has a little more control over their life than they probably should. So if you think about a lot of the, Hallmark young adult or middle grade or children's titles, they're stories where the parents aren't around, right? Harry Potter, he's an orphan and his guardians are neglectful. Hunger Games, Katniss has a single mother, and that mother is compromised by mental illness and disability, and so isn't able to be a fully present parent. The list goes on and on and on and on. In DJ's case, part of why she ends up not in therapy but talking to this rabbi is for her to have ended up in therapy, her mother would have had to be aware enough that DJ was struggling to put her into therapy. That's not a choice that a young person can make and pursue on their own, unfortunately. And in the case of this book, DJ's mother, Rebecca, who I think it's clear in the book is a wonderful person and a wonderful mother in all sorts of ways, but she is a single parent who works a full-time job, who in this story is not just taking care of her daughter, but also of her sister and her brother-in-law and her nephew, while starting a new job and juggling all of that. And so part of why DJ gets as far into this unhealthy coping mechanism as she does is because there's no parental figure noticing her enough to say, wait. If that had happened, then her mother would have put her into therapy. This would be a very different story. But the resource that she does have available, even with her mom not being as tuned in as her mom would have wanted to be. And I want to be clear also that there is an apology from the mom at the end of the book that was really important to me when writing, because I do think she's a good mother, and even good parents make mistakes and have to come to terms with them. So even though mom isn't paying quite enough attention and her daughter is slipping through the cracks, the resource she does have available is she's doing these bat mitzvah lessons anyway, right? Because it actually, I don't know how many people here have experience with a bar or bat mitzvah. In my case, I was bat mitzvah when I was 13. It's a lot of work. In a lot of pop culture representations, you just see the party, but like you have to memorize an entire Torah chapter in a language you don't know to a specific tune that you also didn't know and is not melodic. It doesn't have like a chorus and a verse and chorus and a verse. It's totally random, and it's you have to learn sort of the language of Hebrew and the language of trope, which is the cantillation. It's so complicated, and most kids who are preparing for their bar or bat mitzvahs spend like a full year just taking lessons in that. And then they also have extra lessons with like a rabbi or someone else to figure out their sermon about the Torah portion that they're memorizing, because that's a lot of work too. I mean, think about the average religious service. You're asking a fully, learned and degreed clergy person to stand up in front of you and give a sermon. In a bar bat mitzvah, you're asking a 12 or 13-year-old or occasionally a 14-year-old to do it. That's a big jump in learning. And so part of, as a Jewish person, as a Jewish writer, I really wanted to show that work, to be honest with you, because I don't think it's shown enough. And we deserve a little more credit for everything we're doing. But then also in the situation of this book, right, like, it doesn't take it's such a natural thing. It doesn't take any extra thinking. Of course, DJ is going to be at bat mitzvah lessons. There's no way she can do a bat mitzvah without it. And she's a Jewish child. There's no way she's not having a bat mitzvah. And so I wanted to show in her case that even when you don't have parents or guardians or, adult figures like teachers who are paying close attention to you in that way, you're still in a position where if you can build a trusting, communicative relationship with a professional authority figure who has some experience in this stuff, as many clergy people do, as this rabbi certainly does, there are still resources available to you, right? And so in this world where DJ's mom and aunt and uncle are too preoccupied with their own grief and burdens to see just how much she's struggling as a kid, like many, who masks it very well, right? There's still this other trusted adult who can say, wait. And I really wanted to show that that was possible for her, even when these other resources like therapy, which might have been in some ways preferable had she had it from the beginning, even when those resources aren't available to her. And I think clergy people, I think teachers, librarians, those are all the kinds of individuals that a lot of kids have access to and can benefit from, even when they don't have the medically licensed professionals that we wish all young people did. Yeah. Yes?
I know this is going to be a crazy question. If your setting is a small town in northeastern Ohio, and I grew up in northeastern Ohio.
Okay, wonderful.
How, to me, small towns wouldn't have access to a rabbi. She has to go to a big town?
That's a good question. So at least in modern day Cleveland and the suburbs of Cleveland and the towns around Cleveland, Cleveland has, of course, a gigantic Jewish population.
Right, I'm talking about Charlotte.
Sure. Yes, I will say, first of all, I always envisioned Briar, this town I made up, as more of a combination of like Shaker Heights when I grew up in Oberlin. So like it's centered around a college, college town that's really central to the community. Any community with a really like central college will have some level of Jewish institution. But I will say even in communities like Chardon today, where I've been to before, like there's always a Chabad these days. There's usually like one Reform congregation. And so, and I wouldn't say that's everywhere, but I think when there's a nearby nexus of a really big Jewish community, the way that there is in Cleveland, there's usually enough people who like spread outwards at a certain point, at least today, that there's like some Jewish community. So like in the case of Briar, I have it clearly written that like there is one Chabad, which for those who don't know is Orthodox Judaism. They are more not evangelical, because Jews aren't evangelical, but evangelical to other Jews, wanting Jews to be more Jewish, so they say. They're everywhere. They found me in 7 countries. And then Reform Jews are one of like the less observant, more secular kinds of modern Judaism. And so like somebody who, for example, celebrates some of the major holidays but doesn't keep kosher might be a Reform Jew. And so even in small communities, there might be, or it's more likely that there's not like a fulsome Jewish community, but maybe like one Chabad and one Reform temple, which is what it's the case in Briar. But again, like it's really the college aspect that I think makes it much more plausible. In the case of, I passed a Chabad today, so, but thank you for the question. Okay, does anybody else have questions? Okay, well, in that case, it's truly been a joy to talk with all of you. Thank you so much for having me.